Hello and welcome back for part 3 of the Minotaur guitar build. This episode will again be focusing quite heavily on the neck. The first thing I'm doing here is going to be to glue on the fretboard. And I'm starting by placing some masking tape up here on the line of the nut, and I'm going to use that as a reference point to know that the top end of the fretboard is square to the nut line. This is just sort of an alternate method to things like using locating pins, as locating pins work better once you already have fret slots cut, but in this case I don't, and I don't want to just start drilling holes through the fretboard. So I'm going to use that line of masking tape up at the top because it's a bit more reliable than just a pencil mark, so it's something that's physically there that you can line up the top end of the fretboard with. And then I'm also masking over the truss rod channel so that it doesn't get filled up with glue. You can see I'm carefully lining it up with that piece of masking tape up at the top. And I've also cut it pretty close to its appropriate size, so it's fairly obvious if it's not lined up correctly, because then part of it won't be overhanging the shape of the neck itself. I'm just using some quick clamps at first to hold the fretboard in place and make sure it doesn't slide around when I start putting on the much stronger metal clamps. And of course, the metal clamps I also have to set up some clamping cauls so that they don't damage the wood of the fretboard or the neck. Once I've got two strong clamps in place, I can remove the quick clamps and then start really getting this thing held in place. And this is another situation like gluing up the neck blank where you really want to have some good pressure all the way across the entire joint, so a lot of clamps are necessary. And then once the glue is dry, I come in with this flush cutting router bit. This is different than the last one I used because this one has its bearing up at the top end of the bit, so that is running along the shaft of the neck and just cutting the fretboard flush to that. Yeah, I need to be fairly careful doing this when I'm near the end of the neck, just because that bearing will roll right around and follow the shape of the shaft of the neck, and I want the fretboard to overhang and continue on in a straight line. So here I'm preparing to mark out where I need to cut the fret slots, and I'm just going to tape down my fret scale ruler so that it stays in place while I'm marking out. You definitely don't want it moving around and getting any of those marks out of line with the other marks. I'm just going to draw a little dot at each fret location. Now this neck is only going to have 22 frets. Ideally I wanted to have 24, but with the length of fretboard material I have available, the most I could get was 22. Shorter scale length I could have done 23, but that just seemed weird. I need to move it over and tape it on the other side. And then mark out those same fret locations on the other side of the fretboard. So once all of those marks are in place, I'm going to use this little protractor here. This arm is adjustable with its angle, so I can line it up with both of the dots that I've drawn on the fretboard, and then it's really easy to hold in place while I'm marking out the location for the fret slots. Then once all the lines are drawn, I'm bringing the fret scale ruler back onto the neck and just double checking that all of them are in fact in the right place. Running it down both sides. Better to do this before you start cutting. So I've drawn on where I'm going to cut for the inlay, and I'm just going to begin by drilling out some access points. So with those access points, I can then come in with this Dremel that's got a precision cutting router bit and also a precision router base attached to it. And I'm going to use those to just carefully carve out the material and leave me with the appropriately sized space for the inlay. So with this build, I'm somewhat experimenting with some 2-part epoxy resin that has some red kind of pearloid pigment, and I'm just going to pour that into the space that I've cut for the inlay. So in my prep work for this part, I've also put some light finish on the inside of those fret slots. That's to seal up the wood so that there are no openings in the wood for the resin to either soak into the wood and carry that pigment with it, and also so that air bubbles don't come out of the wood and get into the resin as it's curing. Now there are some bubbles that will naturally form in the resin as it's curing. Some of those are just in there from when the resin was mixed. And I still need to get rid of those, so I have to bring in a little bit of fire. Heating up this resin makes it much waterier, at least briefly. The extra heat just makes it that much thinner, and that allows the air bubbles to rise to the surface and burst on their own rather than getting stuck somewhere inside the resin. So once that's dry, I'm going to come in with a random orbital sander to remove the bulk of the excess that was in place. I don't really need to remove all of it because once I'm radiusing the fretboard that will finish it off, but just to get most of it out of the way, I'll use the random orbital. So once that's done, I'm going to come in and cut the fret slots. The way I like to do this begins with just cutting to depth at each end of the fret slot. So that way I have just a very clear reference point of where each end of it needs to be for it to be in the correct place. And then once those two ends are done, I can move the angle of the saw gradually until the slot goes across and connects both of those endpoints. This is one of those steps where when you do it by hand, really the only thing is you just have to be careful and make sure you're cutting in the right place. It takes time and it takes practice, but it works. And then once those two endpoints are connected, I just finish cutting to the final depth of the fret slot. I'll have to come back and clean these up again once the fretboard is radiused, but I like to have the the slots cut to begin with before I do the radius. So next I'm going to begin carving the profile of the neck. I like to do this while the fretboard is still flat, so that when I clamp it down like this, it doesn't rock back and forth while I'm carving. I probably need to adjust my side profile template just because it leaves me with a neck blank that's much thicker than it needs to be. You can see here I'm carving down to the point at which I want the actual thickness of the neck to be when it's done, or close to it. Again, leaving a little bit extra. But carving away this much material by hand would be very tiresome and time-consuming, so what I'm doing instead is I'm making two reference points, one near the heel of the neck and one near the headstock. And then once I've got those two reference points in place, I'll be able to come in here with an angle grinder and take out the bulk of the remaining material. And I have these two reference points that are very clear visual representations of how much material I can remove without removing too much. So then once that material is out of the way, I come back in with the saw rasp and just clean up this area that I'd done with the angle grinder and get it all flat and level all the way across. And once I've done that, I can begin carving the overall curve or profile of the back of the neck. I don't show very much of that in this video, but it's a lot of this where I'm carving facets and then more and more facets until the whole thing becomes rounded over. And then I come in with a round file and work on the shape of the volute. I'm not shaping the heel quite yet because I want to have the neck pocket cut in the body so that I have that as a reference point to work with and know just how much material I can remove from the heel before I start doing that. Once I'm done roughly shaping the volute, I'll come in with a small random orbital sander with some fairly heavy grit. I think it's 60 or 80 grit sandpaper, and that's just going to remove all the gouges and scratch marks left by the other tools. It won't get it to its final finish or smoothness, but it will get those tool marks out. And so that will about do it for episode 3 of the Minotaur guitar build. Again, I hope everybody that's stuck around this far is still enjoying it, and that I'll see you around for the next one. Worth mentioning, after all of the episodes are up, there will be a full-length build video that shows the entire process from beginning to end. So, look forward to that. And thank you for watching.